So I'm going to talk to an aspect of modern methods of construction that has been getting a lot of attention, which is around the issue of codes, regulations and standards. My background, I work a lot in the arena of building codes, and it's fair to say that modern methods of construction have been getting a lot of attention. A lot of discussion around what modern methods of construction actually mean, but it's fair to say that same pressures are being felt around the world, and that whole topic has been getting attention. So I'd like to step through some thoughts on that subject. First one is really a case that if we were to take a look into London, we'd have to notice that things have continued to change over time. And I put this slide up to remind people that when we talk about modern methods of construction, construction's been evolving over many, many years. So you could look in the foreground, you can probably see the Tower of London, a construction in stone and timber. Beyond it, you can see the City of London and the development of the City of London through the 80s, the 90s and the 2000s saw the rise of numerous steel and glass structures. In and of themselves, they were at their time modern methods of construction. And I think that's what we've got to sort of bear in mind. We have continued as a nation, as a sort of global sort of built environment group, to continue to innovate. And we're subject to similar pressures. If we think about the built environment, we're continuing to see growing expectations of what the built environment will deliver. We're having the challenges of growing urbanisation. More people want to live closer to cities. Maybe that will change post-COVID, I don't know, but up to now, that growing urbanisation has been something that's been coming across the Western world, coupled with an ageing population and growing populations. Societal expectations have been changing as to what do people expect from their built environment and how they're going to use it. And a lot of those pressures are being felt in terms of government policies, the requirement to build more homes, more factories, more buildings that we can sort of enjoy for assembly. And they in and of themselves have driven the need for new building technologies. We're seeing pressure for sustainability. All those things are having an impact on our built environment. Now, a lot of people stop and when we talk about modern methods of construction, they refer to building codes, regulations and standards and ask whether they're keeping pace. Well, the challenge there is often building codes and regulations will often lag innovation, but they do cater for it. But I think we need to stop and probably have a little chat about what do we mean between codes and regulations and standards, just be clear what the differences are. When we talk about building codes and regulations, we're really talking about those legal minimums, those things set in law that tell us how we should build buildings and how they should perform. Over time, we've seen transition from more prescriptive code language into more performance-based language, and that has been one of the enablers for innovation. So to think about it in terms of codes and regulations, they set the minimums and they may say for certain types of buildings, they've got to achieve certain outcomes, i.e. they must be sprinklered, they must suppress a fire, or they have systems in them to suppress a fire. Now, often codes and regulations and the guidance that sits around does not specify those systems, it relies on standards to do that. So codes and regulations often call standards and ask them to be used so that they can achieve certain outcomes. So if you need sprinklers in a building, a code or a regulation or the guidance around it may call for a particular standard to be used. Standards are an important part of that. If you were to open approved document B and look in the references at the back, you'd see over 400 references to different standards that are being used or called upon to sort of meet the intent of our regulations through that document. And they're not all standards. Some of them can be forms of guidance that come from professional bodies. So in this instance, a document from the GGF looking at the best practices in fire-resistant clay systems, something called for or called upon from our guidance, but recognised as the best way to achieve something. So there's that difference between the minimums set out in law, that is the code, and the regulation, versus standards that perhaps tell you how to do something, but very important in the fact that they're used to ensure we define particular outcomes. Now, you can't have gone far in recent months without running into some discussions around regulatory guidance, and people are often quick to point out that it is just guidance. So approved document B here in England, used as guidance to sort of help achieve the outcomes required by regulation. Now, when we talk about modern methods of construction, there's a bit of a twist. The guidance is put in place as a way of complying with the requirements, but there is an allowance to sort of use other methods, and this is the route by which innovation can take place. So it's not always prescriptive that you have to use the guidance, you can use another technique, and in that way you can look at the sort of regulations as a way of defining performance. The guidance tells us how to sort of comply in most common situations, but you could look at alternatives, and that's the realm in which modern methods of construction operate, or indeed largely where innovations operate. It's made clearer, some of you will be aware that you've seen this document launched in July of this year. This was a manual to the building regulations. It again reiterated the fact that a lot of the sort of like the approved documents and the guidance therein was meant for common building types. And it won't have escaped many people's notice to say, actually, some of those conditions that may not be covered by this guidance are around things that we would consider parts of modern methods of construction. So that opens some questions as to how do we deal with those? And there's a gap, but that's in a way the thing that we need to do or really think about when we think about how do we close some of those gaps? How do we ensure that what is being built actually meets the regulations and delivers satisfactory outcomes? The way the regulations have been put together is in a way allowing for innovation. A lot of people will point to some of those shiny buildings I showed in the first slide as a result of changes to our regulations to move from a more prescriptive approach to a more functional based approach that allowed for some of those innovations to take place. The key though is to sort of recognise that you're perhaps operating in an area that's not covered by the guidance, and you need to think about the gap between the two, and are you covering it successfully? So what are the options? Well, one of the options is to sort of go back to basics, look at a full fire engineered solution. So if you're employing a modern method of construction in a new building of a certain size, you might need to go back to first principles to look at, well, what's the fuel load, the fire growth, the situations around that building, to sort of try and define some of the performance characteristics of that building in relation to fire. It takes a lot of effort, it's very bespoke, and it's a solution for the project at hand. But it is a method by which you could go through to try and assure yourself that what's being designed is suitable. Another approach would be to go back to research. Look at building a new building, using a new method or an innovative method. Well, actually, you could go back to doing full-scale research, full-scale testing of assemblies and structures to understand their performance. So from a modern methods of construction point of view, if you think about that, that could be full-scale testing of modules that go into a modular build, and whereby you may go through a system of full-scale testing to understand how the module will perform in a fire, both from a point of view of fire spread through the module, but also at the same time testing the structure. So by loading the structure during that fire test, you could understand how it's likely to perform, generate some knowledge that would allow you to sort of take forward a design to meet the intent of the regulations. The last one that you probably look at is really a case of, are there any other applicable standards? Now the challenge with standards is making sure actually what you're trying to do with a standard is actually right for the situation you have. Are you operating within the scope of that standard? Is it compatible with what you're trying to achieve? But it may only cover elements of a building. But of all those sort of things, standards is a nice way of trying to achieve the right sort of outcome. It's repeatable. It gives you a lot of boundaries in which to sort of operate, and actually going forward to ask somebody else to say, I've done what I need to sort of comply with regulations. Compliance with a standard is a good approach to sort of showing somebody what you've done is reasonable and it's backed by other people who've developed that standard. Fundamental research, sometimes often difficult to sort of compare to real life situations. And going back to the fundamentals of fire engineering design, again, you'll need somebody on the other side who fully understands that. So you can understand why standards may be an approach that people like to take. You can also start to look around the world and see, has somebody else already solved this solution? Is there something applicable? As I said, modern methods of construction are attracting a lot of attention in a lot of different areas. So places like Singapore, they've already started to consider that these types of materials are going to be used, and their own government has started to look at, okay, what are some of the things we need to put in place to help people design these types of buildings? So whether it's, mass engineered timber structures or volumetric structures, their government has started to sort of look at, well, what are some of the features here that we need to sort of put in place to ensure that these structures are going to deliver the right outcome? So perhaps there's something there you could look at to sort of bring back and understand how that you could apply that to a structure you're trying to develop here. Similarly, maybe you look at something like the US. In the US, modular construction comes under a part of their building code called special construction, or more correctly, relocatable buildings. And they go through a process of certificating modules and marking modules in a specific way to show they've actually met the intent of the building code and therefore could be taken to a construction site and assembled together. Again, maybe there's elements within that that could be used to support a case for another building. The key thing though, when thinking about all of those, is really a case of it's about importing the whole solution. And I say this as unashamedly an advocate for sprinklers. One of the key things I keep seeing when we talk about some of these modern methods of construction is that they include elements of combustible construction. And when I talk about importing the whole solution, a lot of those items revolve around part of the solution being suppression in the form of sprinklers. So it shouldn't be a surprise that people are asking for sprinklers to be included in those buildings. See it in Singapore, see it in the US, starting to see the rise of that in places like high-rise Germany. Even some of the discussions in France about timber buildings are starting to attract resistance from the fire and rescue services, who are starting to ask, well, why aren't we putting suppression into some of those buildings? The key thing there, though, is thinking about how will I meet the intent of the regulations? What is the solution I'm implying? Does it meet the intent of those regulations? Can I demonstrate that and support that? And that leads us back to perhaps the most elegant solution to that conundrum is the development of standards. And it's fair to say when we look at modern methods of construction today, the level of standards development is not quite there yet. I know that's a technical term, but it's really where we seem to be. There is a lot of work at the ISO level to look at some of these construction techniques. There has been discussion at a regional level in Europe to discuss this, but hasn't really gone that far. The British standards have started to talk very openly about what needs to be put in place to provide standards to support some of these modern methods of construction. And actually, probably where most of the action is today is probably coming from professional trade bodies through codes of practice and guidance. It's not surprising. If your line of business supports this type of construction, you'll want to ensure that it's done correctly. You'll want to put in place guidance that supports that. So it's not surprising to see that's the level at which standardization is starting to be discussed. Although it's sort of got to get to the next level before we're going to start seeing that really adopted through the regulatory processes. But the key thing here is when we're talking about how do we sort of see the development of some of these structures going forward, standardization in the future is going to be very, very important. And it's not just going to be fire, it's going to be down to some of the basic things about how do you put some of these buildings together. Just simply thinking about how you connect them together is very, very important. Most of us have been working from home and we've connected all sorts of computer items through USB ports and other things. We've never stopped to think that actually that's made possible through standardization. Same perhaps needs to be thought about for some modular construction. How we bring those modules together and fixing them together will be about standardization, as well as how we deal with some of the fire issues, how we put them together, what the structure is capable of withstanding. But to get there and to get to that level of standardization, I'm back to another basic topic, which is research. It's interesting to see we're still talking about gaps in research for some of these techniques. And that means we need to sort of really think about, have we got all that research in place? Have we got the solid foundations for what is needed to be able to use these techniques successfully? You'll note that I'm not saying we shouldn't or we should. The key thing is building on solid foundations. And I strongly believe standardization is perhaps the way to go, but the way to get there is we need the research. We need the solid foundation that enables those techniques to be used. So people aren't scrambling around trying to sort of understand how some of these buildings work in large scale. We've got solid test evidence that backs it up. We've got solid knowledge that can then be used to transform into data that's then used in standards and be done by designers to deliver the right outcomes. So for me, when we talk about this whole issue, it's not just about whether we can, whether we can't, is regulations in the right place. I think fundamentally we've got to understand that we've got the research in place that is the sure footing that says all the other things that we built on top are correct. I think it's a path to good standards, and I think that will open the door to the regulatory processes to accept some of these techniques and ensure that the whole solution is in place. Now, whether that's additional fire protection in the form of sprinklers, whether we need to overclad some of these systems in more plasterboard, that will come from this analysis and this understanding. So for me, in summation, it's really a case of, it's great to talk about regulations, it's great to talk about standards, but to get there, we need solid research that will generate a lot of knowledge, and that will enable us to have the right solutions to deliver the outcomes we're really seeking to achieve. Thank you very much for your time.